The sea was unusually calm that morning, too calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A rescue vessel cut through the mist, its wooden hull creaking against the weight of the tide. Men leaned over the railing, scanning the horizon for a flicker of smoke, a figure waving from shore, any sign of life. But the island ahead lay silent. The captain adjusted his spyglass. There it was, the settlement. Faint rooftops, a scattering of wooden cabins, and beyond them, the tree line. Everything appeared perfectly still. No movement. No sound. No welcome. As the ship approached, the men could hear only the rhythmic slap of waves against the beach. Not even the cry of a gull broke the quiet. When they finally dropped anchor and stepped onto the sand, what they found was impossible. The shore was littered with footprints, yet none led away from the village. Barrels and crates were scattered where the settlers had once unloaded supplies, now swollen with sea rot. A child's wooden toy, a small horse with one broken leg, lay half buried in sand. Its paint had faded under the sun, but the name, Thomas, was still carved beneath it, shaky and proud, like a father teaching his son to write. It was the only name they would find. As the search party moved inland, they called out, voices echoing across the open fields. No one answered. Doors hung open on rusty hinges. Meals sat half-finished on wooden tables, the bread molded to dust, bowls cracked with age. There were no bodies. No bones. No signs of violence. Just absence. One of the sailors picked up a kettle from the ashes of a long-dead fire. It's as if they vanished mid-meal, he whispered. Another found a musket leaning against a doorway, still loaded but untouched. The captain ordered the group to split up and search every hut, every corner of the forest's edge. They found clothes, tools, writing quills, and even open letters, words frozen in time, unfinished, as though their authors had simply stood up and walked away. At the center of the settlement stood a small palisade, the protective wall built by the settlers for defense. It was intact. Untouched. On one of its wooden posts, however, something caught the captain's eye. A carving. Deep and deliberate. 4 letters gouged into the bark of a tree, CRO. He called the others. Together they cleared the brush and found another carving on a nearby post, Croton. The word meant nothing to most of the crew, but a few recognized it, the name of a nearby island, home to an indigenous tribe that had once traded with the settlers. Was it a clue? A direction? Or a warning? They pressed further inland, hoping to find signs of movement toward the Croton tribe's territory. But there were no canoes missing from the shoreline. No trail. No smoke on the horizon. Every trace of the settlers, men, women, and children, had simply dissolved into thin air. The captain's log from that day remains one of the most haunting records in colonial history. He wrote, "We found not a soul. The houses stand empty, the fields overgrown. The people are gone, not slain, not fled, but gone. And only this word, carved deep in wood, remains. Croton." Night fell quickly that day. The crew lit torches, the flames throwing long shadows across the empty village. The wind began to rise, rustling through the grass like whispers. One man swore he heard faint footsteps behind the huts, another claimed to see movement among the trees. But when they turned, there was nothing there. Only darkness. The captain ordered them back to the ship before the tide turned. He lingered on the shore a moment longer, staring at the village one last time. There was something about the silence, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant. Like the island itself was waiting for something, or someone. As the ship pulled away from the coast, the torches onshore flickered and vanished. The men stood in silence, each one glancing over their shoulder, unwilling to speak of what they had seen, or hadn't seen. When the island finally disappeared into the fog, one sailor murmured, "It's not right. It's not right that people can just disappear." The captain wrote one final note that night before sealing his journal: "There are places the world forgets, and perhaps, some places that choose to forget the world. This island, I fear, is one of them." Centuries later, historians would still argue about what truly happened there: famine, mutiny, massacre, assimilation. But on that day, for those men who first stepped onto the empty island, it was something simpler, something far more terrifying than any theory could explain. Because when they left, every clue, every trace of life, every object they had touched, was gone. Swept clean. As if the island had closed its hand and swallowed the evidence whole. And in the captain's own words, the sentence that would echo through history, it was as if they'd simply ceased to exist. Before the silence, before the word carved into wood, there was hope. A promise whispered across crowded taverns and candlelit docks, a new world waiting beyond the sea. In the late 16th century, England was bursting at its seams. Poverty, disease, and hunger stalked the streets of London. The Queen's Wars drained the treasury, and opportunity was a privilege few could afford. Yet across the ocean, tales spread of fertile islands untouched by European hands, lands where the air was clean, the soil rich, and the future unclaimed. It was here that the dream of a new colony began, a place called Roanoke. They called it the jewel of the New World, a sanctuary for the weary and the brave. To some, it was a second chance. To others, it was an escape. Among them was Eleanor Dare, a young woman of 20, newly married, carrying the first child of the colony. Her husband, Ananias Dare, worked as a mason, quiet and devout, a man who believed that faith could build what fear might destroy. To Eleanor, the voyage was more than a migration. It was an act of defiance, a chance to raise her child in a place where the past couldn't follow. And leading them all was Governor John White, artist, cartographer, and reluctant dreamer. He had mapped the world for others, now, he would build his own. His daughter was Eleanor, his grandchild yet unborn. His mission was not just political, it was deeply personal. On the docks of Plymouth, the settlers gathered, 115 souls in total. They boarded the ships Lion and Elizabeth, bound for the distant coast of what would later be called North Carolina. The wind howled, gulls screamed overhead, and as the sails unfurled, a cheer rose up, the sound of hope made flesh. In that moment, they could not imagine that history would remember them not for what they built, but for how they vanished. The crossing was long and cruel. Storms tore at the masts, rats infested the lower decks, and seawater spoiled the food. Children cried through the nights, and sailors whispered that the ocean itself did not want them. But in her journal, Eleanor wrote of the sunrise: "The water burns like glass. I think God has not forgotten us." After months of hardship, the coastline appeared, green, lush, untouched. To weary eyes, it was Eden itself. John White's men rowed ashore first, planting the English banner in the sand. The island smelled of pine and salt, the air thick with heat and possibility. They named the spot Roanoke, after the native people who had once lived nearby. For a time, everything seemed blessed. The settlers built homes from local timber, cleared fields, and gathered oysters from the shallows. The forest seemed endless, and the stars above, eternal. Children played between cabins. The sound of hammers echoed through the trees, proof that something lasting was being made. Eleanor gave birth soon after. The first English child born in the New World, a daughter named Virginia Dare. Her birth was celebrated as a sign of divine favor. The colony had survived the voyage, and now, life itself had begun again upon this foreign soil. But beneath the joy, unease lingered. The land was beautiful, yes, but wild in ways the settlers could not understand. Crops grew thin. Strange cries echoed from the forest at night. The local tribes watched from a distance, their intentions unreadable. Governor White recorded everything in his sketchbooks: the people, the landscape, the faces of hope. But his lines grew heavier with each page, as if the weight of what was to come pressed on his hand. He wrote in his diary, we have come so far, yet I sense that this place will demand a price. The colonists tried to adapt. They learned to fish, to forage, to build stronger shelters. But supply ships from England were delayed, and their food began to run low. Whispers of discontent spread through the camp. Some blamed the governor, others the natives, others still the will of God. Yet, in the midst of growing fear, there were still moments of warmth, a wedding near the shore, songs sung around a dwindling fire, laughter of children running barefoot through the sand. For a brief, shining season, Roanoke was alive. Then came the first disappearance. A hunter failed to return from the forest. The next day, another. Tools began to go missing. Fishermen found their nets slashed. At night, the settlers reported seeing fires deep within the woods, small, flickering, human. But when they went to investigate, nothing remained. No footprints. No ashes. Only silence. The island that had once seemed full of promise now felt like it was watching them. The trees whispered, the wind carried voices, and no one dared to speak of the unease growing in their hearts. Still, they clung to the dream. They had to. John White gathered his people, standing before them under a blood-red sunset, and promised, "We are not forgotten. I will return with food, with aid, with safety. You have my word." And they believed him. They had to believe. As the waves crashed against the shore, Eleanor held her infant close and watched her father's ship fade into the mist. For a long time, she did not move. The wind howled through the trees, and the forest seemed to whisper a single word, a word that would one day be carved into wood and remembered forever. The summer on Roanoke Island began with the promise of abundance, sunlight spilling across the fields, the smell of salt and pine thick in the air. But the beauty of the island soon turned against them. The soil grew dry. The rains came late. And for every fish caught, two seemed to vanish from the shallows. At first, no one wanted to speak of it aloud. The settlers had crossed an ocean for this dream, they would not let superstition undo them. But whispers began to rise among the huts, carried like smoke between the fires. The forest was moving, they said. Children swore they heard voices from beyond the trees, laughter, soft and distant, as if carried on the wind. At night, the hunters returned pale and trembling, claiming they'd seen shapes watching them from the dark. The governor dismissed it as fear. "The forest has eyes," he said, "but only of beasts." Yet when dawn came, they found the traps empty. The prints around them, human. Barefoot. The settlers tried to reason with themselves. Perhaps it was the local Croatan people, curious or cautious. Yet the tribe kept their distance, trading rarely and vanishing as soon as they appeared. Others began to whisper that it was something older, spirits of the land, watching, waiting. Food grew scarcer. Tempers flared. Families argued over rations, and each night, the fires burned smaller. Eleanor Dare recorded her unease in her journal, "The nights are long now. The forest sings when we do not. Virginia wakes crying, and sometimes I think I hear her name in the wind." The governor walked the village each dusk, noting missing tools, scattered footprints, strange symbols etched into the dirt near the fences. He asked who had drawn them, no one answered. The markings were circular, carved deep, always appearing overnight. One evening, a man named William Parsons staggered back from a hunting expedition, his face pale as bone. He had gone out with 2 companions, only he returned. "The woods," he gasped, "they're not empty." He spoke of lights between the trees, moving like lanterns, yet with no bearer. He heard whispers that grew louder the further he ran, words he couldn't understand, and the sound of footsteps behind him that stopped when he did. When a search party went back the next morning, they found no trace of the missing men. Only their bows, lying neatly across a tree stump. Panic began to stir, though none would call it that. They kept to the village after dusk, locked their doors, and prayed by the fire. But prayers did little to calm the dread that now sat heavy in their hearts. Then, one morning, they woke to find the livestock pen empty. Every goat, every hen, every pig, gone. The wooden gate stood open, unbroken. No blood, no tracks. A child found something by the shore later that day, a strip of cloth tangled in seaweed. It was from one of the missing men's shirts. The waves had carried it back, as if the ocean itself was returning what the island had taken. Governor White tried to keep order. He called meetings, wrote letters to be sent with the next ship, urged the settlers to stay calm. But calm was not possible. Not after the fires. The first fire started on a moonless night, a sudden blaze from the far edge of the woods. Men ran to douse it, but when they reached the spot, the flames vanished without a trace. No smoke. No ash. A week later, another fire appeared in the same place, this time closer. And closer still, the week after that. The settlers began to speak in hushed voices about the forest watchers, unseen figures that moved at the edge of sight. Some claimed they saw them standing among the trees at dawn, others swore they could hear them breathing just beyond the walls at night. Eleanor wrote again in her journal, "It is not the dark I fear now, but what listens within it." Then came the disappearance of Thomas, the boy whose name was carved into the little wooden horse left behind on the shore. He was last seen playing near the tree line. His mother turned her back for only a moment. When she looked again, he was gone. No cry. No movement. Only a toy, lying where he had been. The search went on for hours, the entire colony combing the forest, calling his name until their voices broke. When dusk came, they found something, a small footprint in the mud, too small for any man, too wide for a child. And next to it, something carved into the trunk of a tree, a spiral, the same pattern that had begun to appear around the settlement. That night, the colony didn't sleep. The fires were kept high, the walls watched by trembling sentries. The governor sat alone at his desk, quill trembling, writing a report he would never send. The men are uneasy. The women weep. I know not what plagues us, but I feel it watching. There is movement in the woods. We are not alone. Days turned to weeks. The island grew quieter, as if nature itself were holding its breath again. Birds stopped nesting near the settlement. Even the waves seemed muted. One morning, the settlers awoke to find the spiral symbols freshly cut across every door, deep, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Governor White ordered them scrubbed away, but by nightfall, they had returned. The next dawn, they appeared even larger. That was when the council demanded he return to England for supplies, and answers. He resisted at first, but even he could see the truth, the colony would not survive without help. And so, with heavy heart and hollow eyes, John White prepared to leave. As his ship readied on the shore, Eleanor stood with Virginia in her arms, the wind tearing through her hair. She whispered to him, "Promise me you'll come back." He nodded, though his voice failed him. When the ship finally disappeared over the horizon, the settlers turned back toward their homes. The forest stood silent. The air was still. A single toy horse lay near the beach, half buried in sand, its carved name faded under salt and sun. And as night fell, the whispering began again. The sea had turned gray by the time the settlers gathered on the shore. Clouds pressed low, the horizon blurred into mist, and the wind carried the scent of an oncoming storm. The sails of the waiting ship flapped restlessly, as if impatient to leave. Governor John White stood among his people, his boots sinking into wet sand. Every face before him was weary, hollow from hunger, haunted by months of unease. Behind them, the forest loomed like a dark wall, silent and watchful. The council had made their decision. White would sail back to England. He would bring food, men, and supplies. And he would return as soon as the tides and winds allowed. No one spoke as he looked into the crowd. Mothers held their children close. Men avoided his eyes. And through it all, Eleanor Dare, his daughter, stood apart, her infant cradled in her arms. The baby, Virginia, slept soundly, unaware that she was about to lose her grandfather to the sea. White knelt before her. "You have my word," he said softly. "This will not take long. When I return, you'll see sails from this very shore." Eleanor smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "And if you do not return?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The ship's crew began loading what little remained of the provisions, barrels of salted fish, water casks, and trade goods for barter. The tide was shifting. Time was against them. White turned to his lieutenant, ordering him to keep the settlement secure. "Do not stray beyond the palisade," he warned. "Stay close to one another. And if anything happens, if you must move, carve the place of your going upon the tree, as we agreed." The lieutenant nodded, though his face was pale. The settlers gathered at the water's edge as White boarded the small boat that would carry him to the ship. The oars cut through the surf, each pull heavy with silence. He didn't look back until he reached the deck, and when he did, he saw Eleanor still standing there, a lone figure against the wind, her hair whipping across her face. He raised his hand. She raised hers in return. And then the mist swallowed her. The voyage home was long and brutal. Storms battered the ship for weeks, tearing sails and flooding decks. The sea, once calm, now seemed vengeful, as though punishing him for leaving them behind. White wrote in his journal by candlelight, his ink shaking with each crash of the waves, "They wait for me. I see their faces in every cloud, every crest of foam. May God keep them until I return." But fate had other plans. When he finally reached England, the country was at war. The Spanish Armada had arrived, a fleet of terror on the horizon, and every ship, every able man, was claimed for battle. White begged the Queen's officers to grant him passage back to the colony. He pleaded with merchants, shipmasters, anyone who would listen. But the answer was always the same: no vessel can sail. Months became seasons. He wrote letter after letter, each one more desperate than the last. "My daughter waits in hunger. My people perish while I am made idle by war." The war dragged on. Supplies dwindled. Hope grew thin. And yet, he dreamed of Roanoke, dreams so vivid they woke him in sweat. He saw the settlement in moonlight, the houses intact but empty, the trees whispering his name. Sometimes he thought he heard Virginia crying from across the sea. 2 years passed before a ship was finally granted to him, a small, worn vessel bound for the New World. White boarded it at dawn, clutching his maps and sketches to his chest like scripture. He told the captain, "We sail for my family." The crew called him a haunted man. They weren't wrong. As the ship neared the Carolina coast, the weather turned again. The sea churned beneath them, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the compass spun uselessly. But through the storm, White's eyes never left the horizon. Somewhere beyond that curtain of gray was his daughter, his grandchild, his people. At last, the storm broke. The clouds parted just enough to reveal the outline of land, green and ghostly under the sun. Roanoke. White's heart leapt. He could almost see them there, waiting. He pictured Eleanor running to the shore, Virginia in her arms, calling his name. The thought carried him through the final miles. But as the ship drew closer, his excitement turned to dread. The shoreline was empty. No smoke. No figures. No voices. He ordered the men to row ashore. The oars dipped into eerily still water, the sound of wood against sea echoing like a heartbeat. When they reached land, he stepped off first. His boots touched familiar sand, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy, the silence absolute. He called out. No answer. Only the whisper of wind through the trees. The settlement stood ahead, but from this distance, he could already tell, something was missing. The colors were faded, the shapes wrong, the world somehow smaller. As he walked inland, the ground crunched beneath his feet. The sound echoed in the hollow quiet. He passed the first hut, the door unhinged, the windows empty. Another, the same. No people. No smoke. No life. His voice cracked as he called again, Eleanor. Virginia. But the forest did not answer. And there, on the wooden palisade, he saw it, a carving, deep and deliberate. Croton. He froze. His breath caught in his chest. He remembered his words before leaving, carve the place of your going upon the tree. Relief flooded him at first. It was a sign. They had moved, just as planned. But then he saw the rest. Every door hung open. Every tool left mid-use. No graves. No bones. Not even footprints in the sand. It wasn't just that they were gone. It was as if they had never been there at all. The governor fell to his knees, staring at the word burned into his mind, and whispered, God forgive me. I have returned too late. The storm rose again behind him, swallowing his voice. And as lightning split the sky above the empty island, John White realized the truth, Roanoke had kept its promise. It had waited for him. But not for the reason he hoped. The forest did not welcome them. Each step deeper into Roanoke's heart felt like trespassing on something sacred, or something cursed. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay, the ground slick with moss and ash. Governor White moved slowly, his hand brushing the trunks of trees that had grown thicker since his departure. Nature had begun to reclaim everything he once built. The palisade stood mostly intact, but the walls were warped, split by time and weather. The gate hung open, creaking softly as it swayed in the breeze. The sound echoed like a whisper repeating itself, fading into the stillness. Beyond it lay what had once been their refuge, the colony of Roanoke, now hollow and silent. He crossed the threshold first. The others followed reluctantly, crossing themselves as they entered. No one spoke. Even the gulls that wheeled overhead were mute, as if sound itself had abandoned this place. The settlement stretched before them in ruin. The houses, once neatly arranged, had collapsed into themselves. Roofs caved inward, beams blackened by old fires, and the gardens had turned wild, thick tangles of vine and thorn curling over the fences like claws. White walked slowly down the main path, his boots sinking into soft earth. The familiar structures stood like ghosts of their former selves, the meeting hall, the smithy, the watchtower, all silent monuments to failure. He stopped at the well, its rope frayed, the bucket missing. The water inside was dark, motionless, and smelled faintly of rot. He lowered himself to his knees beside it and stared into the depths. His reflection wavered, a face older, more hollow than the man who had left 2 years ago. They lived here, he murmured, almost to himself. They laughed here. They waited for me. The men with him shifted uneasily. One of them, a sailor named Dane, pointed toward the palisade. The word, sir, he said quietly. Croton. Do you believe they went there? White nodded faintly. That was our plan if danger arose. But, he gestured toward the ruins. Why no message left behind? Why take nothing? Why bury no one? No one answered. They pressed on, searching through the wreckage. In one of the huts, White found a small wooden toy, a carved horse, its legs broken, its surface worn smooth by a child's hand. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the grooves, the weight. A sound escaped him, not quite a sob, not quite a word. He placed it gently on the floor. At the far edge of the settlement, near the tree line, they found signs of something stranger. The bark of several trees bore symbols, marks not of English hands, but of another people. Spirals, crossed lines, and circles burned deep into the wood. The patterns were deliberate, ritualistic. White recognized none of them. Indians? One of the sailors whispered. White didn't respond. He stepped closer, tracing the grooves with his fingers. The carvings seemed old, weathered by rain, but beneath the moss the cuts were still sharp. Something about them felt wrong. He remembered the nearby tribes, the Croatan, the Sekatan, the Dasamungwapunk, some friendly, others hostile. He had traded with them, spoken through interpreters, even shared their fires. But none of their markings had looked like this. White's journal records that moment. Here were symbols unknown to me, neither savage nor Christian. They spoke of ritual, of passage, of a thing both buried and born anew. I felt their meaning as one feels a chill before thunder. The men refused to camp within the walls that night. They built fires near the shore, keeping their backs to the sea. White stayed awake long after the others slept, sitting by the flickering light, staring toward the black outline of the settlement. He thought he saw movement once, shadows drifting between the empty houses. But when he rose to look, nothing stirred. Only wind. The following morning, they found footprints in the sand. Small ones, near the well. They led a short distance and vanished where the tide had swept them away. Children, White whispered, his voice trembling. They were here. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The prints were too fresh, too crisp. Could they belong to someone, or something, else? The crew wanted to leave. The island unnerved them, its silence oppressive, its beauty unnatural. One man swore he heard singing during the night, a soft, wordless hum rising from the forest. Another claimed he saw lights moving between the trees, blue and cold as frost. White dismissed their fears aloud, but privately he felt the same chill. Something was wrong here, and the deeper he searched, the stronger that truth pressed upon him. On the third day, they discovered what remained of the chapel. Its roof had collapsed inward, leaving the altar exposed to the sky. The wooden cross was gone. In its place, a circle of stones arranged with unnatural precision. White approached carefully. The stones were smooth, arranged in concentric rings. At their center, a hollow depression filled with ashes, and within those ashes, bones. Small ones. Bird, perhaps. Or not. The sailors refused to come closer. White knelt beside the stones, his hands shaking. He wanted to believe it was some harmless ritual, something the colonists had done for comfort. But in his heart, he knew these were not the customs of England. He reached for his journal and wrote, "The faith they carried across the sea is not the faith they kept. They have changed, or been changed." By dusk, clouds gathered again. The wind rose, and with it came the sound, faint but distinct, a distant cry carried over the trees. The men froze. It was not animal. Not bird. White felt it in his bones. It was human. He shouted into the forest, calling his daughter's name until his voice broke. No answer came. Only the rustling of leaves, the endless sigh of wind through branches. That night, the storm returned. Rain lashed the tents, waves pounded the shore, and the fires hissed out one by one. White lay awake, staring upward, listening to the roar of water and thunder. Between the peals, he thought he heard whispers, low, urgent, almost intelligible. When dawn came, the island was calm again. Too calm. The forest glistened with rain, the air smelled of salt and smoke. The men were ready to depart, begging White to return to the ship. He agreed, though his heart felt torn from his chest. Before leaving, he walked alone to the edge of the settlement one final time. He stood before the tree that bore the word Croatan, tracing each letter with his fingers. The grooves were deeper than he remembered, as if freshly carved. He turned toward the sea, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Forgive me." The tide was rising. When the boats pushed off, none dared look back. But as they rowed toward the waiting ship, a sudden gust swept through the trees, a sound like breath, or laughter, or mourning. The island faded into mist once more, its secrets sealed beneath the weight of years and ocean. And from the distance, as the fog closed around them, Governor White swore he saw a flicker of movement on the shore, a figure standing in the ruins, watching him go. The sea carried them away from Roanoke, but the island did not release its grip so easily. Even as the mist swallowed the shoreline, the men felt its presence pressing on their minds, like eyes following from beneath the waves. Governor White stood at the stern, his gaze fixed on the fading shape of the land. The fog thinned for just a breath, revealing the broken palisade one last time, and in that fleeting moment, he thought he saw someone standing there, a woman, her dress pale against the blackened timbers, her hair whipping in the wind. Then the fog folded shut again, erasing everything. For days, the ship sailed in silence. The crew spoke little, their sleep plagued by restless dreams. One man swore he woke to find wet footprints leading to his hammock and vanishing beneath it. Another claimed he heard a child crying below deck, though no children were aboard. White said nothing, though his eyes had grown hollow, fixed always on the horizon. When they reached England, there was no celebration. No one wished to hear of lost colonies and vanishing settlers. War with Spain had consumed the nation, the Queen's ships were needed elsewhere, and Roanoke was already being spoken of in whispers, a failure, a ghost, a warning. White carried his journals and maps to the council, presenting them with trembling hands. They lived, he insisted. They must have gone to Croton Island. We must send another ship. But his words met blank stares and tired sighs. Too costly, too uncertain. Too haunted. Weeks turned into months. Letters went unanswered. The ships never came. At night, he began to dream. Always the same vision, the island shrouded in fog, his daughter standing at the water's edge, Virginia in her arms. She would call to him, her voice faint, almost lost in the wind, "You left us." He would wake drenched in sweat, the echo of waves in his ears. White grew restless, haunted not just by guilt but by the feeling that something larger was at work. He spoke with sailors who had sailed near Roanoke since his return. Their stories were all the same, strange lights flickering off the coast, as if fires burned beneath the sea, sounds that carried across the water, human and mournful. One captain swore that when he passed the island under moonlight, he saw figures moving along the shore, pale shapes that vanished as his ship approached. Still, no one dared land. By 1593, Roanoke had become a legend. Tavern tales called it, "the island that eats its own." Poets wrote of ghost colonies swallowed by the New World. Children whispered the name to scare each other before bed. But John White could not let it rest. In the autumn of that year, he found passage on a private vessel bound for the Caribbean. The ship's master, Elias Morton, agreed to sail near Roanoke if weather allowed. "One glimpse," White pleaded, "that's all I need." The voyage was long and cruel. Storms battered them for weeks, 3 men were lost overboard. White kept to himself, sketching the coastline from memory, tracing every contour, every inlet, as if drawing could conjure what had been taken from him. Morton began to avoid him, whispering to the crew that the old man carried a curse. When at last the winds turned north, they steered toward the Carolina coast. The sky was bruised purple with dusk when they sighted it, a faint outline in the mist, just as he remembered. Roanoke. But something was different. Smoke rose from its center, not thick and black like a wildfire, but thin, steady, almost deliberate. A signal. White's heart hammered in his chest. "They're alive," he whispered. "They're still there." Despite the crew's protests, he demanded they lower a boat. The sea was restless, the waves sharp as knives, but he would not be stopped. He climbed in first, clutching his satchel and journal. The others rowed in silence, glancing toward the shore with unease. As they neared the beach, the smell of salt gave way to something else, sweet, metallic, faintly burnt. The tide hissed against the sand. Above them, gulls wheeled silently in the air. Then, all at once, the smoke vanished. The fire was gone. The men hesitated, their oars slowing. White urged them onward, but when the first wave broke beneath the boat, the sea surged violently. The rowboat lurched sideways, water spilling in. One man screamed that he saw something moving under the surface, pale hands, reaching. Another shouted that the current was pulling them back. White grabbed the side of the boat, staring down into the dark water, and for the briefest instant, he thought he saw faces beneath it. Dozens of them, eyes open, mouths moving soundlessly, drifting just below the surface like drowned memories. Then the boat spun, and they were thrown back toward the open sea. They never reached shore. When they finally made it back to the ship, the crew refused to try again. "No man lands there and returns," Captain Morton said through clenched teeth. White protested, begged, cursed, but it was no use. The wind turned fierce, and the captain took it as an omen. By morning, Roanoke had disappeared into fog once more. White spent the remaining voyage in silence. He barely ate. At night, the crew heard him whispering in his sleep, speaking to someone no one else could see. "I'm coming back," he would murmur. "I'll find you. Just wait." When they reached Plymouth, he disembarked without a word. Over the next years, John White withdrew from society. He moved inland, far from the sea, into a small house near the marshes. Locals said he was seen walking the water's edge at dusk, always looking east, as if waiting for a signal only he could recognize. He kept his journals close, filling them with drawings, strange ones now. Trees with eyes. Spirals carved into bones. Faces half submerged in water. He died sometime around 1606, his body found by a passing traveler. The house was empty but for his last entry, written in trembling ink, "The island is not lost. It remembers. And it will call again." That should have been the end of it. But the island's story did not die with him. For decades afterward, sailors passing the outer banks spoke of lights flickering along the shore, not the steady burn of campfires, but wandering flames, pale blue and gold, drifting like will-o'-the-wisps. Fishermen who ventured too close reported hearing voices, laughter, weeping, and sometimes a faint lullaby carried over the waves. Some claimed that when storms rolled in, faces could be seen in the water, just beneath the surface, watching the ship struggle past. In 1607, when the Jamestown colony was founded further north, a few of the new settlers whispered that they'd seen pale-skinned figures in the woods, people who spoke broken English, wore feathers and beads, and vanished when approached. Some believed they were the descendants of Roanoke, absorbed into native tribes. Others said they were something else entirely, echoes of those who had never left. By the time White's journals were rediscovered years later, they had already begun to rot. Many pages were unreadable, but the last one spoke of a dream, a great circle carved into the earth, filled with fire, where voices chanted his name. He awoke each night to find ash on his hands and the scent of salt in the air. Even now, the truth remains hidden beneath layers of time and sea. But sailors still tell stories, of lights beneath the waves, of whispers on the wind, of a colony that vanished not because it fled, but because something on that island refused to let them go. And on fog-heavy nights, when the tides rise high along the Carolina coast, some claim you can still see her, a woman standing on the shore, holding a child, waiting for the ship that never comes. The sea forgets nothing. Even when centuries pass, it holds its secrets beneath the waves, waiting for those who dare to listen. After John White's death, Roanoke became less a colony and more a legend, a name whispered in taverns and classrooms, a story told by sailors to warn against the arrogance of empire. Yet, for some, the legend was not enough. The mystery demanded answers. By the 1700s, Roanoke had already earned a cursed reputation. Fishermen refused to anchor near it. Their nets came back tangled with blackened seaweed, sometimes bones. Travelers along the coast claimed they saw lights flickering inland, moving as if by unseen hands. No one stayed long enough to find out. Still, curiosity survived. In 1719, a cartographer named Jonathan Lyell led a small crew to the island, determined to map what he called England's first ghost. His journal, preserved in fragments, described the same eerie stillness John White had encountered more than a century before. "The forest grows thick where once the dwelling stood," he wrote. "We found the remains of a well, the stones strange and cold to the touch. Near it, I heard music, faint and low, as of a child humming far off." Lyell's map of the island was found years later, stained with water and ash. Across one corner, scrawled in a trembling hand, were 3 words: "They were changed." After Lyell, others followed, treasure hunters, scholars, clergymen, each returning with stories that blurred the line between history and haunting. One claimed to have seen shadows of men in armor walking through the trees. Another swore the ground itself pulsed beneath his feet, as though the island were breathing. Yet no one found bones. No graves. No definitive trace of life or death. Only whispers, and symbols carved deep into trees, spirals, circles, and the word Croton resurfacing again and again, like an echo trapped in time. By the early 1800s, the island had vanished from most official maps. The sands shifted, the tides erased its boundaries, and the name Roanoke faded into the fog of history. But legends have a way of surviving even when the land itself does not. Sailors spoke of storms that gathered unnaturally fast near the Outer Banks. Of voices calling from the surf in Old English tones. Some said the voices belonged to the lost colonists, doomed to wander the sea until their story was told. In 1834, a whaling vessel reported seeing a pale figure on the shore during a thunderstorm, a woman in colonial dress, her face hidden by her hair. She raised a hand as if in greeting, and when lightning struck, she was gone. The captain, a hardened man named Isaac Moore, refused to dock near those waters ever again. Then came the discovery of the Dare stones in the 1930s, carved rocks supposedly bearing messages from Eleanor Dare herself. The first stone told a heartbreaking tale, her husband and daughter dead, the colony destroyed, and her plea to whoever might find it, "Father, save us." For a time, the stones reignited the world's fascination with Roanoke. Scholars debated, newspapers sensationalized, tourists flooded museums to glimpse the relics. But the excitement faded when later stones were declared likely forgeries. The truth, once again, slipped into shadow. Yet even without proof, the story refused to die. Modern archaeologists continued to dig along the North Carolina coast, uncovering fragments that only deepened the riddle: broken pottery, a piece of a rapier blade, a European ring etched with a cross. Artifacts that didn't belong to native tribes, yet weren't found where the colony once stood either. It was as though Roanoke had shifted, spreading itself like a stain across the land. Satellite imagery in the early 2000s revealed something stranger still: faint geometric patterns beneath the soil, visible only from above. Perfect circles, laid out with eerie precision, matching the same formations described centuries earlier by both White and Lyell. When researchers dug into the site, they found nothing: no structures, no tools, just disturbed earth and ash. Soil analysis showed traces of metal and human bone dust, but too little to identify. One scientist later admitted, under condition of anonymity, that their instruments malfunctioned while on site. "Compass needles spun," he said. "Batteries drained." The readings went wild. It was like the island didn't want to be measured. And then, there were the sounds. Local fishermen began reporting them again, humming, low and rhythmic, echoing from beneath the water. Some recorded it, posting clips online. The audio was distorted, but experts who analyzed it noted a repeating pattern every 17 seconds, similar to a human voice trying to form words. The pattern matched the rhythm of the word Croton. Even now, the island, or what remains of it, seems to defy explanation. Coastal erosion has reduced it to fragments, sandbars shifting with each storm. Yet boats still go missing in its waters. In 2011, a research vessel vanished off the Outer Banks while conducting sonar scans near the site. The last transmission received was garbled, but a few words were clear: voices. In the deep, the wreckage was never found. To this day, historians argue. Some say the settlers joined the Croatan tribe and their lineage still lives on in local communities. Others insist they succumbed to starvation, disease, or native hostility. But none of those explanations account for the absence: no remains, no graves, no wreckage of flight. The most unsettling theory comes from those who study not history, but patterns: linguists, folklorists, and cultural historians who believe Roanoke wasn't the first disappearance of its kind. Across ancient maps and colonial records, they've traced a repeating symbol: the spiral. From Norse carvings to Celtic tombs to Native American petroglyphs, the same mark appears, always near stories of vanished people and cursed lands. A cycle, some say. A calling. And when the tides pull low and the fog creeps inland, some claim to hear faint singing beneath the sound of the waves, not mournful, not human, but something older, echoing across time and sea alike. It is said that the sea still holds their names. That if you listen long enough, you can hear them whispered back, not as a warning, but as a promise: we are not gone. We are waiting. Every mystery eventually invites an answer, or at least, an attempt to fill the silence it leaves behind. And Roanoke's silence has lasted more than 400 years. Over those centuries, historians, explorers, and dreamers have proposed countless explanations. Yet none have fully erased the unease that clings to the name. The most common theory, and the safest one, is that the settlers simply left. Starvation, drought, and dwindling supplies could have forced them to seek refuge among the Croatan tribe. There are hints to support it: reports of English features among later native populations, a few blue-eyed children, and fragments of European tools found far from Roanoke itself. But those traces, faint as they are, tell only half a story. If the settlers had lived on through the Croatan, why did no message ever reach England? Why did no ship, no explorer, no missionary ever find a thriving English village on the mainland? Why did the word Croton remain carved not as a message of hope, but like an epitaph? Archaeologists point to drought. Tree-ring studies show that the years surrounding the colony's disappearance were among the driest in centuries. Crops would have withered, fresh water would have grown scarce. Yet even then, starvation leaves evidence: bones, tools, traces of camps. Roanoke left nothing. That absence is what haunts every logical explanation. It's what turns a historical puzzle into a ghost story. The second theory is darker. Some believe the settlers were slaughtered by local tribes angered by English intrusion. There are vague accounts of conflicts in nearby regions, of sudden violence and retribution. But again, there were no bodies. No burned remains. No weapons left behind. Instead, there were the symbols. Those spirals, those carved patterns found on trees and stones. No tribe has ever claimed them. Linguists who've studied White's drawings and later explorers' journals agree, the marks predate English arrival. They appear in native carvings, yes, but also in Norse and Celtic sites centuries older. The spiral, an endless circle, often represented rebirth, time, or passage between worlds. Some historians dismiss it as coincidence. Others see a thread that stretches across civilizations, connecting ancient burial mounds in Ireland, Viking ruins in Newfoundland, and the haunted sandbanks of Roanoke. The third theory came much later, born not from scholars, but from whispers among sailors and priests. It spoke of a curse. Long before the English landed, the Algonquian peoples of the region believed the island was sacred ground, a place where the barrier between the living and the spirit world thinned. They called it Der Ossakon, the place that remembers. According to their legends, the island was where great spirits met the souls of the drowned. It was said to consume those who disrespected it, swallowing them whole into the mists. When the settlers built their homes there, they cut into land that was not theirs to claim. They cleared the trees, burned the soil, and drove their iron tools into ground once used for ancient rituals. Some of the tribes warned them. Others watched in silence. If the curse is real, it wouldn't have struck with fire or war. It would have been slower, creeping through dreams, through hunger, through fear. A presence that whispered until men turned on each other, until reason broke, until every trace of them was absorbed into the earth. One chilling account supports this. In 1608, 2 years after Jamestown's founding, explorer John Smith recorded a story told to him by local tribes. The Croatan, he wrote, spoke of white men among them, but said they had changed, they are not as before. Their eyes black as the night, their voices wrong. Were they merely absorbed settlers, or something else? A later letter by a Spanish missionary in 1620 adds another strange detail. While traveling the Carolina coast, he visited a native village and described meeting pale ones who spoke in broken English and prayed to no God I knew. He left the village at dawn, convinced he had seen souls who should not walk. There is, too, the legend of the Roanoke lights. Early colonists at Jamestown swore they saw distant fires burning on stormy nights far down the coast. The lights moved, vanished, and reappeared, always in the same place. When explorers finally went to investigate, they found only ash. And in the ash, burned into the soil, the word again, Croton. Even stranger is how the word itself keeps appearing, across centuries, across tragedies. When Edgar Allan Poe was found delirious and dying in Baltimore, his last word, according to one witness, was Croton. When the writer Ambrose Bierce vanished in Mexico in 1913, the word was carved into the post of his abandoned shelter. When Amelia Earhart's plane disappeared, her diary reportedly contained the same word scrawled in the margin. Coincidence, perhaps. Or a reminder that the island's shadow stretches further than its shores. Modern scientists scoff at the curse, yet even their instruments falter on Roanoke soil. Compass needles spin without cause. Cameras malfunction. Drones lose signal midair. Geologists have found traces of magnetic anomalies under the surface, readings that defy logic, pulsing in irregular intervals, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Some believe these pulses are natural, the result of mineral deposits or shifting sands. Others, however, see them as something else entirely, remnants of whatever force took the settlers and still stirs beneath the island's bones. For centuries, every expedition that's tried to solve Roanoke's mystery has returned with more questions than answers. The story resists closure. It resists truth. Perhaps because it was never meant to be solved. The line between history and haunting blurs easily on Roanoke, between what was lost and what was taken. And maybe, as some whisper, that's the island's greatest secret, that it does not destroy what it claims, it keeps them waiting. Watching. So that, someday, when the fog returns and a new ship crosses its horizon, it can whisper once again, come closer. We remember you. For centuries, Roanoke remained a ghost story whispered through taverns, classrooms, and history books, a mystery frozen in amber. But in the last 100 years, science, archaeology, and obsession have tried to thaw that silence. The story of these investigations is not only about uncovering bones and ruins, it's about the people who chased the ghosts of an island that refused to yield its dead. It began earnestly in the late 19th century when scholars, driven by Victorian curiosity and imperial pride, began searching for England's lost colony. Among them was Talbot W. Brown, an amateur historian who believed Roanoke settlers had marched inland to join friendly tribes. He organized small expeditions, catalogued pottery fragments, and wrote letters filled with certainty. But his notes end abruptly in 1895 with a line that reads, "The ground hums at night. The forest does not want us here." His team abandoned camp a week later. By the 1930s, the search for Roanoke had become something of an American obsession. Newspapers published serialized accounts of treasure hunters and archaeologists combing the Carolinas for clues. It was during this frenzy that the so-called Dare Stones appeared, a series of carved rocks allegedly left by Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. The first stone, discovered by a tourist, bore an inscription claiming that the colonists had fled west and suffered greatly, ending with the haunting line, "Only 7 alive. Our child is gone." For a moment, it seemed the mystery was solved. But skepticism followed. Many stones turned out to be forgeries, likely created by opportunists hoping to sell them to desperate historians. Yet, 1 or 2 stones, the earliest ones, have never been conclusively proven fake. The language, the carving style, the weathering, all strangely consistent with the late 1500s. Even now, experts remain divided. Then came the Cold War. In 1951, an aerial survey for military mapping picked up an anomaly, a faint rectangular outline beneath the island's surface. It was too precise to be natural. Excavations revealed wooden postholes arranged in a defensive pattern, perhaps the remains of a fort. But the wood was wrong. Radiocarbon dating placed it not in the 16th century, but the early 17th. A later construction, built by someone else. A ghost fort above a ghost colony. By the 1990s, technology brought new hope. Ground-penetrating radar, sonar scans, and satellite imagery uncovered strange depressions and buried shapes around the island. One particular site, marked Site X, drew attention, a location 50 miles inland that contained fragments of Elizabethan pottery, a gunlock, and a copper ring bearing a Tudor rose. Archaeologists believed they had found the settlers' second home. But the evidence was maddeningly incomplete. The pottery could have been traded. The ring could have been dropped centuries later. The island seemed to mock its pursuers, always giving just enough to keep them digging, but never enough to let them rest. In 2013, a breakthrough of sorts emerged from an old map, John White's original chart of the coast, preserved at the British Museum. When researchers examined it under UV light, they discovered something stunning. Beneath a patch that had been pasted over the map lay a small, hand-drawn fort symbol. A hidden mark. White himself had concealed it. The fort's location matched Site X. Had he known where the settlers went all along? Had he tried to tell the Queen, but been silenced by politics or pride? The discovery reignited public fascination, but also paranoia. Soon, amateur explorers flooded the region, armed with metal detectors and wild theories. Some claimed to hear whispers in the woods near Site X. One group reported their compass needles spinning wildly when approaching an overgrown mound. A journalist covering the dig wrote later that the air felt charged, as if the island itself was breathing. Among the modern researchers, none became more infamous than Dr. Helena Price, an anthropologist whose obsession with Roanoke bordered on madness. In 2009, she led a privately funded expedition, convinced the settlers had performed ritualistic ceremonies to appease something on the island. She claimed their disappearance wasn't survival or slaughter, it was transcendence. Her team recorded strange phenomena, sudden temperature drops, unexplained static in their equipment, and low-frequency sounds no one could trace. One audio file captured what seemed to be a woman's voice repeating the word home. When analyzed, the frequency pattern bore resemblance to human speech, but with no identifiable language. 3 weeks into the dig, Dr. Price vanished. Her tent was found torn open from the inside, her notebook scattered and soaked by rain. In her last entry, written in hurried ink, she had scrawled, "The pattern is the key." The spirals matched the sound. They were not lost, they were called. Her disappearance was ruled accidental. Locals called it something else, Roanoke's claim. After that, official funding dried up. The island was declared a protected archaeological zone. Only licensed teams could conduct research, under strict supervision. Yet, every few years, someone returns. A filmmaker, a historian, a dreamer. They camp on the beach, hoping to capture a revelation on camera. And sometimes, they find things they can't explain. In 2017, a group of graduate students used drones to scan the coastline. Their footage, later uploaded to an academic forum, showed a faint pattern in the sand, 3 overlapping spirals, forming a triangle. The next frame glitched. The drone fell into the ocean. When recovered, the device still contained the last 5 seconds of video, fog creeping toward the camera, and what looked like footprints leading into the surf. No one ever claimed responsibility for doctoring the footage, and no metadata anomalies were found. Still, it's easy to dismiss these things. Easy, until you visit the island yourself. The soil feels wrong, loose but heavy, as if holding on to something it refuses to let go. The trees sway without wind. And when night falls, the sound of the waves carries voices, soft, broken, almost pleading. Roanoke is more than a vanished colony, it has become a shadow stitched into the fabric of American consciousness, a myth that refuses to die. For centuries, its story has drifted like fog through generations, shaping folklore, literature, and even the quiet fears of those who live along the Carolina coast. The island may have swallowed its settlers, but the world has never stopped hearing their echoes. In the early 1700s, sailors whispered of ghostly lights off the Outer Banks, glowing orbs that drifted above the water and vanished when approached. Fishermen called them the lanterns of the lost. They said that if you followed them, the sea would claim you too. Some claimed to hear laughter in the surf, others the faint beating of drums. It was always in the same place, the stretch of coastline where Roanoke once stood. By the 1800s, the mystery had become a literary obsession. Writers and poets wove tales of cursed settlers, doomed love, and restless spirits. Nathaniel Hawthorne hinted at it in Twice Told Tales. Later, Edgar Allan Poe, fascinated by the concept of the vanished and the buried, made private notes referencing Crotone, the gate unseen. His handwriting trembled. It was a word that would appear again in his final delirium. Then came the spiritualists of the late 19th century. Mediums claimed they could speak to the lost colonists. In smoky parlors, by candlelight, they described visions of men and women wandering through fog, calling for their captain, their voices distant and hollow. A few seances even produced strange sand mixed with salt water, as though the sea itself had risen to answer. In 1901, a psychic named Clara Wood wrote in her diary that a woman named Dare appeared to her during a session and whispered, "We are not dead, only dreaming." 2 weeks later, Clara was found drowned in her bathtub, her eyes wide open, her hand clutching a seashell filled with sand. The story of Roanoke evolved with each era, bending to the fears and fascinations of the time. During the Great Depression, it was told as a parable of hope lost to hardship. In the Atomic Age, it became a metaphor for annihilation, how an entire civilization could vanish in an instant. In the modern age, it became something else entirely, a mystery of consciousness, of dimensional boundaries, of time itself. Pop culture has never been immune. Films, novels, and television have all reimagined Roanoke, sometimes as horror, sometimes as tragedy. Each retelling adds something new, yet the feeling remains the same, unease, as if we are peering into something ancient that never fully closed. But beyond fiction lies a stranger truth. There are places across the world where Roanoke's shadow seems to reappear, disappearances too similar, too clean. No struggle, no trace, just absence. In 1955, a research team studying weather patterns near Cape Hatteras vanished without distress signals. When rescuers arrived, their instruments were still active, coffee cups still half full. The logbook ended with a single line, "The mist came in from the east." In 1971, a family camping near the coast of North Carolina disappeared overnight. Their tent stood untouched, the campfire still burning. Local police found the same spiral symbols carved into a tree nearby. They dismissed it as vandalism, but the photos of those carvings vanished from evidence years later. And in 1999, a Coast Guard ship responding to a distress signal near Roanoke Island found no vessel in sight, only thick fog. When they returned to base, the radio operator reported picking up a faint transmission on an unused frequency. It was a woman's voice saying, "We are home." The recording was archived and later lost. These modern echoes have blurred the line between legend and phenomenon. Some scientists attribute the disappearances to rogue waves, magnetic fields, or psychological illusion. Others whisper that Roanoke is not a location, but an event, something that moves, repeating itself wherever the conditions align. Cultural historians call this the Roanoke pattern, the way stories of mass vanishing reappear across time, from the Anasazi to the Mary Celeste to the Dyatlov Pass.